Oh, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Eric Scott Sills? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Eric Scott Sills was born on April 27, 1965, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. He went by the name Scott. In 1987, he earned a bachelor's degree. In 1992, he earned a medical degree. And 21 years later, in 2013, he earned a PhD in molecular biology. He began his career in medicine, working at a New York City hospital in the obstetrics and gynecology department. In 1998, he started working at a reproductive clinic in Atlanta, Georgia. He focused on in vitro fertilization, otherwise known as IVF. While he was there, one of his patients was a woman named Suzanne Stephanie Sills. She had been born in 1971 and was married. Evidently, Suzanne was quite impressed with Scott and attracted to him. Suzanne left her husband and married Scott. Using IVF, the couple had 2 children, Mary Catherine and Eric. The family moved around quite a bit as Scott took on different positions. They lived in North Carolina, New York, Dublin, Ireland, and eventually ended up in San Clemente, California. Scott and Suzanne co-founded a fertility clinic in Carlsbad called the Center for Advanced Genetics. Scott was the medical director, and Suzanne was the office manager and receptionist. The main service offered by the clinic was IVF. Many of the clients were from China and other Asian countries where fertility treatments were not permitted. The family lived in a 5-bedroom, 3,000 square foot house at 11 Via Concepcion in San Clemente. It cost about $800,000 when they purchased it. At the time I'm making this video, the house is for sale for $1.9 million. Prior to marrying Suzanne, Scott had been married and divorced. He had 2 children with his ex-wife and had to pay her alimony. Despite earning a lot of money, Scott was struggling financially. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Sunday, November 13, 2016, at around 6:30 a.m., Scott Sills called 911 and reported that he and his daughter Mary Catherine had found Suzanne Sills injured at the bottom of the stairs. Scott initially referred to his wife using the term patient and made it seem like she must have fallen down the stairs. When first responders arrived, they quickly realized that Suzanne was dead. Here's what the police found during the course of their investigation. Suzanne had died sometime around 5 a.m., about 1.5 hours before Scott called 911. She had severe injuries to her face and neck. Her hands and forearms had sustained what appeared to be defensive injuries. Suzanne had a ligature mark around her neck, and her cause of death was strangulation. There was a scarf next to her, which had been around her neck at the time she was discovered. Mary Catherine removed the scarf when Scott attempted CPR. When first responders arrived, they noticed that Suzanne's right foot was on the lower step of the staircase. This was odd because the 911 operator had told Scott to put Suzanne on a flat, hard surface for CPR. It's almost like Scott left her foot there intentionally to demonstrate how the stairs must have been the culprit. By speaking with the family members, investigators learned that Suzanne had migraine headaches. She slept in her daughter's bedroom on the night she died because being there made it easier to manage the headache symptoms. Scott's son Eric told the police that he woke up at around 4 a.m. because his parents were screaming and yelling. In Mary Catherine's bedroom, where Suzanne had been sleeping, the police found blood on a wall, a nightstand, and the curtains. Later, it was determined the blood matched Suzanne and Scott. Clumps of Suzanne's hair were found on the floor of the bedroom. Suzanne's blood was found on the shirt that Scott was wearing when she died, and Scott's blood was found under Suzanne's fingernails. Scott's story to the police was that he and his daughter found Suzanne unresponsive at the bottom of the stairs. He denied any involvement in her death and said she must have fallen. When the police asked Scott about the blood in his daughter's bedroom, he had no explanation. Despite a substantial quantity of evidence indicating that Scott murdered Suzanne, he was not arrested until April 2019, about 2.5 years after Suzanne died. He was released on a $1 million bond, but his children were not allowed to live in the family house with him, mostly because of the murder part. Scott was not about to let facing a murder charge interfere with his career. He published a book about fertility 3 months after his arrest. Due to the COVID pandemic, Scott's trial was delayed a few years. On December 19, 2023, Scott was found not guilty of first-degree murder, but guilty of second-degree murder. On March 15, 2024, he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Now moving to my analysis. Scott Sills maintains his innocence, and he has a few supporters. They argue that Suzanne's death was just an accident, another example of how staircase violence has grown out of control. The state, of course, disagrees. Even though it took them a long time to charge Scott, they believe the evidence is clear. This brings me to the question, was Scott guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. The injuries on Suzanne's body were consistent with being the victim of a brutal attack. For example, she had what appeared to be defensive injuries. Her cause of death was strangulation. Staircases are dangerous, but they typically don't strangle people. When Scott was on the 911 call, he did not start CPR right away. He stalled for about 5 minutes. Instead of moving Suzanne to start CPR, he left her right foot on the bottom step as if to demonstrate how the staircase was involved in her death. A scarf was found around Suzanne's neck when she was discovered. Why would she have been wearing a scarf at that time of night? This makes it seem like the scarf was put there to cover the ligature mark on her neck. Although he later changed his story when he testified at trial, Scott's son Eric initially told the police that he heard his parents screaming and yelling at 4 a.m. Suzanne died sometime around 5 a.m. In the room where Suzanne had been sleeping, her daughter's bedroom, the police found blood from both Scott and Suzanne. Mary Catherine said the blood was not there earlier. Clumps of Suzanne's hair were found on the floor of that bedroom. On the shirt that Scott had been wearing when his wife died, the police found Suzanne's blood. Under Suzanne's fingernails, Scott's blood was located. Scott had an abrasion on his forearm, and there was a cut on his head. A hat had been used to conceal this cut. It seemed odd that Scott would wear a hat inside the house. The police found no evidence of a break-in. Realistically, the only person in the house physically capable of murdering Suzanne was Scott. There were some problems in the relationship between Scott and Suzanne. She once texted him, "I will never be free, ever. You are killing me. Don't you see that? I just want out." As far as a possible motive, Scott may have been upset because his wife posted a topless photo of herself on a conservative online chat room. She did this because she lost a bet over whether Donald Trump would win the Republican nomination for president. In Scott's office, the police found a printout of a conversation that Suzanne had with another member of the chat room that was on the topic of this photo. Scott clearly knew about her behavior, and maybe he wasn't too happy about it. Moving to the exculpatory factors, Scott's defense argued that the blood found in Mary Catherine's bedroom was only from Scott. He cut his hand on a nail when changing a window screen. The cut on Scott's head could be explained because he had been working on his vehicle. He burned his arm and hit his head against the hood when he reacted to that burn. Wearing a hat was not unusual. Scott routinely wore a hat during the winter. As far as the clumps of Suzanne's hair on the floor, she had hair extensions, and it was not unusual for her hair to fall out. At the time Suzanne died, she had several substances in her system, including tramadol and Valium. Furthermore, she suffered from a fainting disorder and often had vertigo when her migraine headaches were active. It stands to reason that she could have lost her balance and tumbled down the stairs. Scott's defense argued that Suzanne's spinal cord was injured when she fell down the steps. This would have resulted in her being unable to breathe. The ligature mark on her neck was caused by one or both of the family's large and playful dogs. The dogs weighed 90 pounds and possessed the physical strength to strangle Suzanne by pulling on the scarf that was around her neck when she fell down the stairs. Canine DNA was found on that scarf. As far as the topless photograph motive, the defense argued that Scott was not upset by his wife posting this picture online. He had even offered to take the photograph for her. When considering all the evidence, do I think that Scott Sills was guilty of murder? Yes, I am convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of second-degree murder. The jury came to the right decision in this case. Scott did not plan the murder, rather he killed Suzanne in the heat of the moment. In order for Scott to be not guilty, one has to invest in the theory that the family dogs killed Suzanne by themselves or in combination with a staircase fall. Essentially, here's what Scott would have people believe. His wife Suzanne tumbled down the stairs because she lost her balance from substances used to treat her migraine headache. Even though it was nighttime and she was inside her house, she was wearing a scarf. While Suzanne was at the bottom of the steps, severely injured but not dead, the dogs stood there looking at her. For some reason, these dogs had a long-standing grudge against Suzanne. Maybe she was stingy with the dog biscuits. There's no way to know for sure. Seeing Suzanne in a vulnerable state, one dog looked at the other and said, "This is our chance." The canines decided to commit murder. This conspiracy had been brewing for a long time. These dogs had a bone to pick, but they lacked the necessary components to follow through. For example, opposable thumbs and firearm training. This may have been their only chance to kill their master. After the dogs strangled Suzanne by pulling on her scarf, they realized a flaw in their homicidal plan. One dog asked, "How do we know that Scott won't find a new lover who will also fail to make with the dog biscuits?" They decided to frame Scott by planting his blood in the bedroom where Suzanne was sleeping and under her fingernails. They also put Suzanne's blood on Scott's shirt. Apparently, these dogs were masters of stealth, like ninja dogs. After the murder was complete, the dogs admired their handiwork and never believed they would become suspects. The dogs may have been onto something. Even though Scott's defense attorney did implicate them at trial, he was careful not to suggest they had a criminal state of mind. The attorney said, quote, "I'm not blaming the dogs for anything. They are just dogs. They do what dogs do. They like to tug on things," unquote. Is it possible the attorney vastly underestimated the criminal capabilities of these crafty and clever canines? Did culpable canines conceal a carefully calculated and complex conspiracy? This theory is barking up the wrong tree. It is more reasonable to believe that Scott murdered his wife. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. This case is fairly straightforward. For some reason, which may never be known, Scott became aggravated with his wife and impulsively strangled her. After this, he made a desperate and obvious attempt to cover his tracks. Because he was a physician and could afford a good attorney, the state proceeded very slowly to make sure they had a solid case. It took a long time to get justice for Suzanne. Now moving to my final thoughts. The theme of this case is that Scott Sills was both the giver and the taker of life. Suzanne was attracted to him because he could give life and never suspected that he would take it. He helped many people to have children, but he also helped one person, his wife, to exit this world. Inside many people, even those in helping professions, there is the capability to kill and falsely accuse dogs for the heinous homicide. Those are my thoughts on the case of Eric Scott Sills. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.